How are Ojas, sexual energy, and semen in men related exactly? Are there any recommendations as how often or how much a man can release in order to keep his spiritual aspirations alive and not go crazy at the same time? Are there any practices to be in harmony with this energy? How are Ojas, sexual energy, and semen in men related exactly? Well, Ojas is a byproduct of all digestive processes, right? Ojas is an expression of the final dhatu, the seventh dhatu, reproductive dhatu. Dhatu is a tissue in English. Dhatu is a Sanskrit term for the term tissue. So, and according to Ayurveda, and Tantra, of course, here they are intertwined here because they all have the same provenance in Atharva Veda. There is this understanding that all digestive processes, all of them, all together without exception, all metabolic processes, lead to the formation of Ojas, or it must. That's the way we are made. That's the way we are designed. So Ojas, therefore, is seen as that final byproduct of all digestive processes. And Ojas here, in a way, is a sum total. Reproductive tissue can be spoken in terms of the final seventh level. But Ojas exceeds all that. Ojas is often spoken in terms of the immunological power, the luster of the aura that is projected outwards into the physical space to a certain level beyond the physical parameters of the body. So in other words, the strength of one's Ojas, or let me rephrase it. The strength of one's luster, the strength of one's immunological substance is paramount to the level and quality of the Ojas. So Ojas is that insulating layer on one hand. And on the other hand, it's that layer of where consciousness, as it were, returned to its states of purity through these stages of digestion. Because all these are stages of digestion. From the moment we put our food in the mouth, from the moment we lay our eyes on something, because that's the same thing, right? We're talking about impressions. When we eat food, is an impression that sustains our body, sustains our cells on an energetic level, nutrient level, and all the rest of it. In the same way, we take impressions through the eyes, through the ears, through tactile experience of sense of touch, and the full gamut of five sensory perceptions. All this goes into impressing ourselves with something, taking in impressions. And then these impressions begin to be decoded, metabolized, digested. At the physical level of intake of food, it will go through all the respective levels of digestion at each respective level of the dhatu, right? From plasma to blood to muscle, fat, to bone marrow, finally reproductive tissue. All the 7 levels it will travel. They say it takes 28 lunar days for the process to be completed. And at each level there are respective digestive processes taking place. We spoke about it periodically, we speak about it, it's a fascinating topic. For example, if certain dhatu, or ability to digest and assimilate and extract, is impeded at a certain dhatu, at a certain level of the tissue. Let's say at the bone level, right? It's the 5th asti. Then what will be passed on to a more refined dhatu, as it must, will already be incomplete in a way, missing something, because there is an impediment at the level of that respective dhatu, which takes the goodness that is passed on from the previous one, whilst further assimilating into itself, into its structure, and passing it on in a more refined state to the structure that precedes from there, so that it ends up into what we then call immunological substance, in Sanskrit termed Ojas. So with the impressions, not just food, the same process. All the impressions will take in mental, psychological, emotional, and sensory. Somewhere in my exchanges, because this topic, this question reoccurs from time to time, we spoke about it, and I felt the need to also bring a reminder that it's not the quantity of the ojas, but the quality of the ojas that here matters the most when it comes to the transformation of consciousness or any of the process associated with this alchemical transmutation of the basic qualities. Because it's not just the raw quantity of the ojas, but the state of the ojas, which in itself rarefied enough for it to be fit to fuel the process. And this is very interesting, is because that's where the impressions are almost paramount to the quality of that, what and how ojas can be developed. So I gave example, I remember, I think it was in Austria, the Advaita Congress, that we forget that we take a lot of impressions through this sense of sight, seeing. And it is the subtle development of ojas at that level that brings about the most refined quality in ojas. In other words, that's the receptivity to beauty, an ability to extract beauty. It's the way of seeing. So, because a lot of young men, not just young men, men in general, feel, well, okay, so what are the substances that feed ojas? And you say, yes, of course, like the soaked almonds, bleached and made into almond milk, the ghee, honey, like onion juice, like that. Think something that replenishes very quickly the ojas. Dates, figs. But that doesn't mean that the more ghee you eat, the more ojas immediately is being built. It's a very, very, I would say, incomplete understanding. The quality of ojas here will only make someone, plainly speaking, physically more active, more excited, more prone for desiring that sexual conduct one way or another. But for spiritual transformation, it's the refined quality of the ojas that is required. It's the difference between butter and ghee, clarified butter, if we are to speak maybe in the analogy. They are related, but they're very different products. You leave the brick of butter outside your fridge for 2 days and it will go rancid. And you can leave a jar of ghee properly made for 100 years and it's not going to go off. Because it's an entire different substance now. So going back to this sexual energy and semen in men, they are all interrelated, of course, because reproductive tissue, reproductive power is all interconnected. So the ojas, the sexual power, the semen, the count of semen, all this is interconnected, obviously, all interconnected. And since the question has this practical aspects to it, right? That what is recommended here? How to deal with this? For someone who has spiritual aspirations, which is important, of course, addition. So as to, alive and not to go crazy at the same time. Again, this is the invitation to look into it in terms of the understanding of one's constitutional not predispositions, one's constitutional setup. So there are even ratios given roughly. If someone predominantly Vata build and in the healthy, in the balanced state, for them, sexual activity and the discharge of semen once a week is a perfectly fine thing to do. Someone who, let's say, has, because of age, illness, any other restrictions, exhaustion, whatever else, then that, of course, is reduced because Vata easily goes out of balance. Someone who is Pitta predominantly by constitution has more fire in them, therefore there's more power for digestion, more power for metabolizing everything. So that is increased. So let's say twice compared to the Vata. And with Kapha, where that kind of raw substance is considered to be the most in terms of reserves and reservoirs that built into the body, can have and can afford to have, let's say, discharge of semen 3 times a week without impeding the physiology too much. But this, again, these ratios are highly, I would say, cannot be applied and projected on everyone. I'm speaking about relatively like active men in their prime, providing there are no obvious impediments in their physiology and in anything. But this ratio is being spoken in Ayurveda. In Ayurveda, Kapha is known to be given license to indulge in sexual intercourse and discharge more often than Vata, period. Why? Because of the constitutional setup. Why? Because Vata wears itself out too fast, too quickly, you see? And of course, this is where we enter this realm of where we cannot put that same, painting everything with the same brush. There are intricacies, and there are even tridoshic constitutions where someone has the 3 doshas in equilibrium or in the same amount almost. It's more rare, but it happens. So this tridoshic, you see, then obviously the answer is that it's somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle. But again, what my suggestion here is personal experience. That's what's the most important. You need to notice how sexual activity make you feel. If going through prolonged periods of withholding semen or without physical, let's say, encounters, interactions, whether with a partner or by yourself, makes you feel good, strong, then there's nothing wrong in allowing these phases of accumulation of that energy if it's not accompanied by unpleasant, undesirable psychological sense of isolation, let alone if it is driven by a certain sense of guilt, certain sense of uncleanliness, because this is very often intricately associated. These questions like that came up before. Some men more, funny enough, common amongst men, feel unclean. They feel guilty to self-pleasure themselves because of whatever reasons they are. And the reasons may be many. You see, so one need to acknowledge this, where it comes from, where these patterns originate, where they stem from. Because body is always innocent, body is always sacred. Every expression of the body, even the bodily desire, is sacred and innocent. But of course, the line between indulging and falling prey to a variety of patterns which then becomes addiction is also proverbial. It's very well known. And it's incompatible with spiritual life because it begins to impede our progress and process there and then. So therefore, it's just going back to here to the question itself. Are there any practices to be in harmony with this energy? Yes, of course, there are practices in certain traditions, deistic tradition in particular, intricate about all this, and it goes into great length, but mostly from the place of increasing the enjoyment, pleasure, longevity, strength, not so much in terms of spoken in terms of the assisting this transmutation of basic qualities into higher states of consciousness. But you can find this, I cannot just give you off the bat the recommendations, but there are works out there translated into languages which speaks about this. And I'm not talking about the tantric retreats or kind of a tantric literature that was proliferating in the 70s and the 80s and in the 90s, where certain tantric practices were brought out into the open, as it were, very often in distorted, if not convoluted way, to be promulgated as shortcuts to nirvana or shortcut to enlightenment, or at least to extraordinary way of enjoying one's physical capacities. But it's more to do with that level of psychological hygiene of consciousness here. So that there is this clarity in terms of the symbiotic relationship of what that might represent, of what that reservoir of energy represents. And understanding that this energy is not something that can be casually played with, can be kind of like, no matter how we may feel, it's always sacred reservoir of profound energy, profoundly creative. It's the transformative energy. But for the young people who live household alive, where they are not involved in practices which sublimate that energy, because the sublimation of energy here is the question. If you can find, and sometimes the grace works in mysterious ways, that we are thrown into the states of phases, at least, where the sublimation of that energy is an easy thing to do because it somehow governed by already certain movements. You see? For example, it's very well known. Now I will give this analogy, although gave it many times. It's the same with any creative process. Creative as among creative people, as artists, creators, and those who, let's say, belong to the scientific mind. In order to make breakthrough somewhere, in order to arrive to a certain state, certain flow states where laws of nature, as it were, open up themselves, or where the creative outpouring becomes one's natural state, is inseparable from the sublimation of that energy. Inseparable. In other words, it will be nearly impossible to create anything if there is not enough of that energy, because that energy is the creative and procreative energy. It draws from the same reservoir. So the sexual energy here is spiritual energy, is creative energy. So one way or another, there need to be a sublimation of the raw state of that, what expresses itself as sexual energy, so that it can assist in the transformation of sorts, of any kind. And you can see that, how that very energy is then transformed into a work of art, transformed into a breakthrough, into a discovery, into whatever that is, the genius we speak of. All that is due to the expressive potentiality of how this energy manifests itself. So, advices here are only at the level of being very, very attentive to how it makes you feel, down from the practical level of what it is like, you see? It cannot be reduced to a mechanical, a clinical level. I would not recommend that. I would not recommend that, you see? So there has to be this understanding that the answers, of course, are here, can be drawn from existing sources, literature, and we should do that. But also, I would bring something as a reminder, just as with an example of Ojas. What feeds Ojas the most is what gives us these cathartic experiences whenever we come in contact with something which brings forth these experiences. So in other words, beauty here is not just somehow a pleasant experience of seeing something or hearing something. It literally assists in connecting us with that, what is the most refined aspect. And this what feeds now our immunological system, that Ojas at a subtle level. In the same way here, one, as it were, is positioned between the near impossibility of physical obstinance, because one needs to be predispositions towards that, to what is always open to expelling oneself, expanding oneself through the indulgence, because that's what this also energy is, how it displays itself. You see? So what's the answer? Where do you find yourself in that? My suggestion is to avoid, as much as one can, particularly for men, because it's more common to men. It's of course not uncommon to women. I don't want to just suddenly make this, but it's more common to men, to the casual sexual encounters. Casual sexual encounters, even if they are culturally being appropriated, like, what's the big deal, right? It's okay. But every encounter has to enrich us. That's what we're talking about. So I'm going back to that experience of beauty, which is the most refined level of producing Ojas through that experience, because it assists through something, or assists something which cannot be just, let's say, taking 250 or 300 milligram of ghee, or taking, honey, and taking this and that food. Like you can eat whatever food you want, it will not produce refined ojas. It will only produce the quantity, which then would need to be cooked, as it were, refined, rarefied. In the same way here, whatever we do needs to be done consciously. That's what's the answer here. So you feel the urge, physical urge, because it's universal, normal. You are in your prime. Every man from the age of 16 to whatever that could be extended, enter that, and then becomes the balancing act. And so is for women. But in men, as it were, man is in a more disadvantage simply because of the greater possibility of expelling that energy and expanding oneself. The reasons for that are subtle. The act of ejaculation is accompanied by a release of semen, discharge of semen. And that semen is in terms of its quality and quantity, consciousness. It went through this whole process because it will and meant to give life to another being. In that primordial state of affairs, it carries in potentiality life always. It always carries life. But it's not just carries life at the physical level, it's also consciousness, you see? It went through all these stagely processes. That's how, at least inside the intricacies of Ayurvedic tractates spoken of. So discharge of semen, it's in a way a physical act of discharge of level of consciousness. And you need to notice if you, when you given yourself to physical activity, does that accompany by a certain loss of consciousness or not? You see? Do you feel depleted, not just physically tired here and this, could be normal and restorative, but do you feel psychologically less? You see what I'm saying? Do you feel like you are lost in something? What we can't afford is to feel like, when men come, as it were, and immediately that what was so acutely put at the level of pressure is deflated immediately, there and then. Completely and utterly deflated. It should not be accompanied by drop of consciousness, let alone feeling depressed, melancholy, blue. This is not tantric. This is anti in terms of understanding of what sexual desire, pleasure, and sexual might represents. It should still uplift, elevate, and inspire us. If it doesn't, then something is not right. You see? So this is what I'm trying to say here, so that always at the personal level, you need to become master in your own body. You need to attentively examine, notice. Do not sweep under the carpet. Do not just put a blind eye. Do not allow this to become some kind of okay, well, now I need to relieve myself quickly. I need to relieve. This is it. And, and then you will begin to notice, and then you will begin to realize that it's could be a beautiful dance. It could be a beautiful balancing act. So this is my encouragement. But recipe-wise, again, it's all individually depending on all the aforementioned factors.